Hello, survivors. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel. We appreciate it, and thank you in advance. Please leave the name of the city you're listening from in the comment section below. It helps us see our reach in the community. Let's start the story. The cabin lights flickered first. I was in seat 14C, middle section of Flight 447, reviewing presentation slides on my laptop when the Boeing 777 shuddered violently. Not the usual turbulence. This was different. The kind of shake that makes your bones rattle and your stomach drop into your shoes. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice crackled over the intercom, but I could hear the tension beneath his professional calm. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties and will be making an emergency descent. Please fasten your seatbelts and assume brace positions." Technical difficulties. Such a clinical way to describe what felt like the plane was tearing itself apart. The woman next to me, Laurie Hunt, I'd learn her name later from her passport, gripped my arm so hard her nails drew blood through my shirt sleeve. Her face was pale, eyes wide with terror. Across the aisle, a businessman was praying in what sounded like Japanese, his voice barely audible over the growing mechanical screams from the engines. The oxygen masks dropped with a collective gasp from the passengers. I fumbled with mine, hands shaking as the plane pitched forward at an impossible angle. Through my window, I could see the ocean rushing up to meet us, dark and endless under the overcast sky. That's when the real panic started. A flight attendant stumbled down the aisle, her usually perfect composure shattered. Blood ran from a gash on her forehead where she'd hit something during the violent descent. "Brace, brace, brace," she kept shouting, but her voice was drowned out by the screaming of metal and passengers alike. The last thing I remember was looking around the cabin one final time. A middle-aged man was clutching a briefcase to his chest. An elderly woman was clutching a rosary. And Laurie Hunt was still squeezing my arm, her lips moving in what looked like a silent prayer. Then the world exploded into darkness, to cold and the taste of salt water. I woke up face down in wet sand, salt water burning my lungs as I coughed up what felt like half the Pacific Ocean. My head was pounding, vision blurry, and every muscle in my body screamed in protest as I pushed myself up on trembling arms. The transition from the nightmare of the crash to the surreal quiet of the beach was jarring. No more screaming engines, no more terrified passengers, just the gentle sound of waves lapping against sand and the distant cry of seabirds. The beach stretched maybe 200 yards in each direction, bordered by jagged volcanic rocks and dense jungle vegetation. Behind me, the ocean rolled in steady waves, deceptively peaceful under the gray morning sky. Scattered across the sand like broken toys were pieces of Flight 447, seat cushions, luggage, chunks of twisted metal that had once been part of a Boeing 777 carrying 312 souls. I was apparently the only one left alive. My left shoulder was dislocated. I could tell from the sickening angle and the fire that shot down my arm when I tried to move it. Blood had dried on my forehead from a gash above my right eyebrow. My business suit was in tatters, the white shirt now a grimy brown from sand and seawater. My left shoe was missing entirely, and I had no memory of losing it. But I was breathing. My heart was beating. Somehow, impossibly, I was alive when 311 other people weren't. The first hour was pure survival instinct. I spent most of it just trying to stand without falling over. The dizziness came in waves, and twice I had to sit back down and put my head between my knees to keep from passing out. When I finally managed to stay upright for more than a few minutes, I began searching the wreckage. Most of the debris was useless. Waterlogged electronics, torn clothing, twisted metal that looked like abstract sculptures of destruction. But scattered among the wreckage, I found a few things that might help me live another day. A partially intact first aid kit, 2 bottles of water that hadn't been contaminated by seawater, some snacks from the galley service cart, and a small emergency radio that looked damaged but might still work if I could dry it out. I also found a waterproof bag containing someone's camera and what looked like a survival guide. The irony wasn't lost on me. Someone had been prepared for adventure, just not this kind. The island itself was small but manageable, maybe half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide, shaped like a kidney bean. Volcanic rock formations created natural shelters along the northern shore, and I could hear the sound of fresh water trickling down from somewhere higher up in the jungle. Palm trees and other tropical vegetation suggested the climate would be survivable, at least for a while. It could have been worse. Much worse. By 10 a.m., I'd managed to relocate my shoulder using a technique I half remembered from a first aid course years ago. The process involved lying on my back and using the weight of my arm to pop the joint back into place. The pain was excruciating. I actually blacked out for a few seconds, but the relief afterward was immediate and worth every second of agony. I cleaned my head wound as best I could with bottled water and wrapped it with gauze from the first aid kit. The bleeding had stopped, but I knew head injuries could be tricky. For now, I seemed to be thinking clearly, which was a good sign. That's when I first saw the smoke. 2 thin columns rising from the horizon, maybe 15 miles out. Ships, I thought immediately. Rescue ships. My heart actually jumped with hope for the first time since waking up. I grabbed a piece of reflective metal from the plane's interior and started signaling, angling it to catch the morning sun and flash signals toward the distant vessels. But as I watched, something felt wrong. The smoke was too dark, too thick. Black smoke, not the white or gray you'd expect from normal ship operations. And as the minutes passed, I realized the columns weren't moving toward me. They were just there, stationary, like the ships were dead in the water. Over the next hour, I counted 3 more smoke columns appearing across the horizon, all of them just sitting there, burning. No movement, no signs of rescue operations, just fires on the ocean that shouldn't exist. By noon, the wind shifted and brought the smell to the island. It wasn't the clean scent of burning fuel or wood. This was something else entirely, something organic and putrid that made my stomach clench and my throat close up. I'd smelled it once before, during a house fire in my neighborhood where an elderly man had died and wasn't found for days. It was the smell of burning flesh, human flesh. I tried the emergency radio repeatedly, scanning every frequency I could access. Nothing but static, no distress calls, no rescue coordination, no maritime traffic control, no voices at all, just an empty silence that felt heavier and more ominous with each passing hour. The isolation was starting to get to me. I found myself talking aloud, just to hear a human voice, even if it was my own. Around 1 p.m., I found the first body, Laurie Hunt, according to the water-damaged passport in her purse. The same woman who had gripped my arm during our final descent, mid-30s, traveling alone, probably on vacation based on the guidebooks and camera equipment scattered around her belongings. She'd washed up on the eastern side of the island, where the current had deposited most of the heavier debris. But Laurie hadn't drowned. That much was immediately obvious. Something had torn chunks of flesh from her neck and left forearm. The wounds were ragged and deep, like bite marks, but bigger than any animal bite I'd ever seen. Her fingers were missing on her right hand, not cut off cleanly, but ripped away, leaving jagged bone and sinew exposed. And her eyes. Her eyes were gone, just empty sockets filled with sand and tiny crabs that scuttled away when I approached. I've seen accident victims before, car crashes, industrial accidents during my consulting work. This was different. This was deliberate. Violent, like something had fed on her. The thought made me physically sick. I spent the next 10 minutes throwing up seawater and what little food I'd managed to eat. I found 2 more bodies before the afternoon ended, scattered along different parts of the beach. Both passengers from my flight. I recognized their faces from the boarding area, all showing similar wounds, all missing pieces of themselves. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Something had attacked them, torn them apart, and taken parts of them away. As the afternoon wore on, I began to hear sounds carried on the wind, low groans that seemed to echo across the water, guttural and barely human. They came from the direction of the nearest burning ship, growing more frequent as the hours passed. I climbed up to the highest point on the island, a rocky outcrop about 40 feet above sea level, and looked out at the ocean through a pair of binoculars I'd salvaged from someone's luggage. What I saw through those lenses chilled me to the bone and changed everything I thought I knew about survival. The burning ships weren't empty. Figures moved on their decks, dozens of them, shambling between the flames, seemingly unaffected by the fire consuming their vessels. And some were in the water, floating but still moving. Still making those awful sounds that weren't quite screams and weren't quite moans. Their movements were wrong, jerky and disconnected, like broken marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. They moved without purpose but with terrible persistence, and even from this distance something about them made my skin crawl. As the sun began to set on October 15th, I realized that whatever had killed my fellow passengers might not be finished. Some of the figures in the water seemed to be drifting with the current, and if that current was bringing them toward the island, I had no idea what was coming for me or when. But I knew I needed to be ready for a very long night. I spent that first night huddled in a shallow cave formed by volcanic rocks on the island's northern shore. The opening faced away from the ocean, which seemed like the smart choice given what I'd seen through those binoculars. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, every wave, every rustle of palm fronds, every distant groan carried on the wind made my heart race. The emergency radio sat beside me, still picking up nothing but static despite my attempts to dry it out. I'd wrapped it in torn fabric from my shirt and left it in the sun all afternoon, but the salt water had done its damage. My lifeline to the outside world was dead. Around 2 a.m., the groaning stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the sounds had been. At least when I could hear them, I knew where they were. Now, floating somewhere in the darkness between me and those burning ships, I had no idea what was happening. I dozed fitfully until dawn, jerking awake every few minutes convinced I'd heard footsteps on sand or the splash of something emerging from the waves. October 16th, 6:30 a.m. I was checking my makeshift shelter when I heard the first splash. Not the regular rhythm of waves against rock, but something deliberate. Something heavy hitting shallow water. I crept to the cave entrance and peered around the volcanic stone that concealed me. A figure stood waist-deep in the surf about 100 yards down the beach. At first glance, it looked like a person. A man in what had once been a ship's officer uniform, now torn and stained beyond recognition, but his posture was all wrong. Head tilted at an angle that should have broken his neck, arms hanging loose at his sides like they were disconnected from his body. Then he turned toward me and I saw his face. The entire left side of his skull was caved in, exposing brain tissue that had turned black and was crawling with maggots. His remaining eye was clouded white, like milk, but it tracked my movement with disturbing focus. His jaw hung open, revealing teeth stained dark with dried blood and bits of flesh caught between his molars. He started walking toward shore, and that's when I realized this wasn't a person anymore. Each step was mechanical, purposeful, but completely wrong. His left leg dragged behind him, the foot twisted backwards, but he didn't seem to notice or care. He just kept coming. I backed deeper into the cave, my hands shaking as I grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the plane wreckage. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. The thing reached the beach and began shambling in my direction. Its movements were erratic, like a broken toy, but there was an unmistakable determination in how it navigated around obstacles. It could sense I was here. As it got closer, I caught the smell, sweet and rotten like fruit left too long in the sun mixed with something much worse. The stench of advanced decay, so thick I could taste it in the back of my throat. I pressed myself against the back wall of the cave and tried not to breathe. The creature passed within 10 feet of my hiding spot, its head turning from side to side like it was searching. Through the gap in the rocks, I could see more detail than I wanted. Its uniform hung in tatters, revealing skin that had turned a sickly green-gray color. Patches of flesh had simply fallen away, leaving exposed ribs and organs that should have killed it instantly. But it was still moving, still hunting. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, it moved on, shambling toward the island's interior. I waited until I couldn't hear its dragging footsteps anymore before I dared to move. That's when I saw the others. 4 more figures were emerging from the surf at different points along the beach. A woman in a shredded evening dress, her throat torn open so wide I could see her spine. A man in a business suit, the same one who'd been praying in Japanese on the plane, missing his lower jaw completely. 2 others so decomposed I couldn't tell what they'd been wearing, or even if they'd been male or female. They all moved with the same shambling gait, all searching, but their movements were completely random. One would start heading in my direction, then get distracted by a piece of debris and wander off. Another walked straight into a tree and kept pushing against it for several minutes before changing direction. These weren't smart. They were driven by basic instincts, hunger, and the primitive urge to follow sounds and movement. I realized with growing horror that these were passengers from my flight. People I'd seen in the boarding area. People who'd died in the crash just like I should have. But somehow they'd come back, changed. I had to move. Grabbing my meager supplies, I slipped out the back of the cave and began working my way along the rocky coastline. The volcanic formations provided decent cover, but I had to be careful not to dislodge any loose stones that might give away my position. From my new vantage point, I could see more of them emerging from the ocean, at least a dozen now, maybe more. They shambled without purpose, bumping into rocks and trees, sometimes walking in circles when they lost any scent trail. But their persistence was terrifying. They never stopped, never rested, never gave up the hunt. What struck me most was how they moved. Individually, they were clumsy, damaged, barely functional. They would follow my scent for a while, then lose it and wander off in random directions. But there were so many of them now that their random searching was starting to cover the entire beach. I watched one of them, the woman in the evening dress, find my footprints in the sand around my former hiding spot. She began following them with the persistence of a bloodhound, but when the trail led to the rocks, she got confused and started walking in circles. I realized I had maybe an hour before one of them randomly stumbled across my new position. The island's interior was dense jungle, but it was my only option. I crashed through the underbrush, no longer caring about stealth, just distance. Vines caught at my torn clothing and scratched my face, but I kept moving. Behind me, I could hear them thrashing through the vegetation, drawn by the noise I was making. I found temporary refuge in a cluster of large boulders about halfway up the island's central hill. From there, I could see back toward the beach and assess the situation. What I saw made my stomach drop. More of them were emerging from the ocean. Dozens now. They moved randomly, some wandering aimlessly along the beach, others stumbling into the jungle without any pattern. But there were just so many of them, and they weren't just from my plane. Some wore ship uniforms, crew members from the burning vessels on the horizon. Others had civilian clothes that suggested they'd been passengers on those ships. All of them had been changed into these shambling horrors. As I watched, one of them, I think it had been the businessman who'd been praying during our descent, stopped directly below my hiding spot and looked up. Its eyes were gone, just empty sockets weeping a thick, dark fluid. But it tilted its head like it was listening, and I realized it had heard my breathing. I held my breath until my lungs burned, but it was too late. The thing opened its mouth and released a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite a moan, not quite a scream, but something that seemed to vibrate in my bones. The call echoed across the island, but the other creatures didn't seem to understand it. Some turned toward the sound briefly, then continued their aimless wandering. A few stumbled in my general direction, but they were drawn by the noise itself, not any coordinated response. I ran anyway. The next several hours were pure nightmare. I had advantages. I was faster, more agile, and could think strategically. But they were relentless. They never got tired, never stopped, never gave up. Every time I thought I'd lost them, one would appear from an unexpected direction, drawn by some sound I'd made. I learned things about them during those desperate hours. They were attracted to movement and sound, but their tracking was erratic and easily confused. They showed no fear of injury. I watched one fall off a 15-foot cliff, break both legs, and continue crawling after me using only its arms. But they had no strategy, no planning ability. They were driven purely by basic instincts. By noon, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and running out of places to hide. The island wasn't big enough to keep this up indefinitely. I needed a new strategy. That's when I found the cave system. Hidden behind a curtain of vines on the island's eastern face was a narrow opening that led into what looked like an old lava tube. It was maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, big enough for me to crawl through, but too narrow for the shambling infected to navigate easily. I squeezed inside, hauling my few supplies behind me. The tunnel went back about 20 feet before opening into a larger chamber. It was dark and humid, but it was defensible. Only one way in, and I could hear anyone approaching long before they reached me. The infected found my hiding spot within 2 hours. I could hear them outside, bumping into the rocks around the entrance, making those horrible groaning sounds. They tried to squeeze through the opening, but their damaged bodies lacked the coordination for the careful movements required. They would get stuck, thrash around for a while, then back out and try again. But they didn't give up, and worse, they didn't leave. As the afternoon wore on, more arrived. They gathered around the entrance to my cave, not through any plan or coordination, but simply because they were all drawn to the same thing: me. They bumped into each other, stepped on fallen bodies, and showed no awareness of their companions. Each one was focused solely on the scent and sound of living prey just out of reach. That's when I realized the horrible truth. They didn't need to reach me. They just needed to keep trying. I had maybe half a bottle of water left, and no food at all. Eventually, thirst or hunger would force me out to them. It wasn't strategy or intelligence on their part. They simply didn't know how to give up. Their primitive brains were locked onto one target, me, and they would stay here until either I came out or they rotted away completely. As the sun began to set on my second day on the island, I looked out through the cave entrance at my grotesque audience and tried to figure out how to survive the night. The groaning had started again, but now it was coming from directly outside my hiding spot, a chorus of the dead, calling to others still in the water. By morning, there would be even more of them. The worst part wasn't the fear or the desperation. It was the recognition. In the fading light, I could make out faces I remembered from the plane: the businessman with his missing jaw, the woman who'd been clutching a rosary during our final descent, now missing both arms but still wearing her wedding ring. And there, pressed against the entrance to my cave, was Laurie Hunt, the woman who'd grabbed my arm during our crash, whose terror had been so raw and human. Now she stood among the dead, pieces of her missing, her remaining eye fixed on me with the same hungry focus as the rest. Whatever had happened to my fellow passengers, whatever had turned them into these things, it was patient, it was relentless, and it was right outside my door. I was trapped in a cave, surrounded by the walking dead, with no hope of rescue and dwindling supplies. The radio was broken, the island was overrun, and every hour brought more of them from the ocean. As darkness fell and their moaning grew louder, I began to understand that I might not survive another night. The night was when I truly understood the meaning of desperation. I'd been trapped in that lava tube for 8 hours, listening to the infected outside scratch at the rocks, bump into each other, and make those horrible groaning sounds. My water was gone. My lips were cracked and bleeding. Every muscle in my body ached from being cramped in the narrow space. The creatures outside never stopped moving. They bumped into each other mindlessly, fell over rocks but always got back up, always kept reaching toward my hiding spot. Their numbers had grown throughout the evening as more washed ashore from the burning ships on the horizon. I counted at least 30 of them by midnight, 30 walking corpses that had once been human beings, now trapped in their own rotting bodies, driven by nothing but hunger. Around 3 a.m., I made the decision that would either save my life or end it. I couldn't stay in the cave. Dehydration was already affecting my thinking, and I knew I had maybe 6 hours before I'd be too weak to move at all. If I was going to die, I'd rather die fighting than waste away like a trapped animal. I grabbed the sharpest piece of metal from my supplies, a jagged fragment from the plane's interior that was maybe 8 inches long. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all I had. The plan was simple: create a distraction at one end of the cave entrance, then slip out the other side while they were distracted. Find the highest point on the island and signal for help with my emergency flare. It was my last shot. I threw a rock as hard as I could toward the far end of the cave entrance. It clattered against the volcanic stone with a sharp crack that echoed through the night air. The effect was immediate. Every infected outside turned toward the sound and began shambling in that direction. They pressed against each other, reaching for the source of the noise. Their primitive brains locked onto the distraction. I slipped out the opposite side of the entrance and began creeping toward the beach. The moonlight was bright enough to see by, but it also made me visible if any of them happened to look in my direction. I made it maybe 50 yards before one of them spotted me. It was the ship's officer I'd seen earlier, the one with half his skull missing. He turned toward me with that jerky, broken motion and opened his mouth to make that horrible sound. But before he could alert the others, I was on him. The metal fragment punched through his remaining eye socket and into whatever was left of his brain. He dropped instantly, collapsing like a puppet with cut strings. But the sound of our struggle had attracted attention. 3 more were already turning in my direction. I ran toward the beach, no longer caring about stealth. Behind me, I could hear them thrashing through the vegetation, drawn by the noise of my passage. More joined the chase as my footsteps echoed through the jungle. I reached the beach just as the first rays of dawn began to brighten the horizon. The sand was littered with more bodies than I'd seen before, some still moving, others lying motionless where they'd washed ashore and couldn't get back up. The highest point on the island was the rocky outcrop where I'd first spotted the burning ships. It was maybe 100 yards away, but the direct route was crawling with infected. I'd have to circle around and approach from the water side. I splashed into the surf, hoping the water would mask my scent. The ocean was warm against my legs, but the salt stung every cut and scrape on my battered body. Behind me, the infected had reached the beach and were starting to spread out, searching randomly for my trail. That's when I heard it. A distant rhythmic thumping sound like a giant's heartbeat echoing across the water. I looked up at the sky and saw it. A military helicopter maybe 2 miles out, heading in my direction. Rescue. Real, actual rescue. I started running through the shallow water toward the rocky outcrop, no longer caring about the noise I was making. The helicopter was my only chance, and I had maybe minutes before it passed the island by. I reached the base of the rocks just as several infected spotted me from the beach. They began shambling toward my position, their movements clumsy but relentless. I started climbing, my hands bleeding as I grabbed onto the sharp volcanic stone. The helicopter was getting closer, but it was still too far away to see me clearly. I needed to get higher, needed to signal them somehow. Halfway up the outcrop, I encountered my first real obstacle. A narrow ledge with maybe 3 feet of space and no clear handholds above it. Worse, I could hear the infected below me starting to climb. They were slow and clumsy, but their damaged bodies seemed to feel no pain from the sharp rocks. I pulled myself onto the ledge and looked down. At least a dozen of them were trying to follow me up. Most kept falling back down, their broken limbs unable to coordinate the complex movements required for climbing. But a few were making progress. One of them was Laurie Hunt. She'd lost most of her left arm, but she was using her remaining hand and her teeth to pull herself up the rock face. Her movements were grotesque but effective. Pieces of her were missing. Her face was a ruin of torn flesh and exposed bone, but she kept coming. I couldn't fight her. Even knowing what she'd become, seeing her struggle up those rocks with such determination broke something inside me. This was the woman who'd gripped my arm during our final descent, who'd been just as terrified as I was. I forced myself to keep climbing. The helicopter was close now, maybe half a mile out. I could see figures in military gear looking out the open sides, scanning the island. But there were so many infected on the beach below that the pilot was maintaining altitude, probably thinking the island was completely overrun. I reached the summit just as the helicopter started to bank away from the island. In desperation, I pulled out my emergency flare and lit it. The brilliant red flame cut through the dawn air like a beacon. The pilot saw it immediately. The helicopter stopped its turn and began flying back toward the island, its rotors chopping loudly through the humid air. But my flare had also attracted every infected on the island. They came from all directions, drawn by the light and smoke. Dozens of them, stumbling out of the jungle, climbing over rocks, all converging on my position. I was trapped on a small rocky summit with nowhere to run, and a growing horde of zombies closing in from below. The helicopter circled overhead, and I could see someone in uniform looking down at me through binoculars. They were assessing the situation, trying to figure out if a rescue was possible with so many infected in the area. I waved the flare frantically, shouting over the rotor noise even though I knew they couldn't hear me. The first infected reached the base of my rocky perch and began climbing. Their broken fingers found purchase in the volcanic stone, and they hauled themselves upward with grim determination. Laurie Hunt was among the first to reach my level. Up close, I could see that most of her face was gone, revealing the skull beneath. Her remaining eye was clouded and weeping thick fluid, but it tracked my movement as I backed toward the edge of the summit. Behind her came the businessman from the plane, his throat torn open in a gaping wound. Then the ship's officer, brain tissue still leaking from his shattered skull, and more behind them, an endless parade of decay and death. I was out of space. Behind me was a 40-foot drop to the ocean. In front of me, the walking dead. The helicopter moved into position directly overhead, and a rope ladder dropped down, but it was still 15 feet away, too far to reach, and the infected were almost on top of me. "Jump!" someone shouted from the aircraft. "Jump and swim for it!" I looked down at the water below. The fall might not kill me, but I wasn't sure I had the strength left to swim, and there might be more infected in the ocean, walking along the bottom. Laurie Hunt lunged forward, her remaining fingers reaching for my leg. I could see the hunger in her ruined face, the mindless drive that had replaced everything human about her. I had no choice. I jumped. The fall felt like it lasted forever. I hit the water hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs and sending shockwaves of pain through my already battered body. The ocean was surprisingly warm, but the salt stung my cuts and made my dehydration worse. I surfaced gasping and immediately started swimming toward the helicopter, which had moved to hover over deeper water. The rope ladder dangled maybe 40 yards away. Close, but it might as well have been miles given my condition. Behind me, I could hear splashing as some of the infected followed me off the cliff. They couldn't swim, but they didn't need to. They just sank like stones and started walking along the ocean floor, their arms reaching up toward the surface. I forced myself to keep swimming, each stroke an agony of exhausted muscles and burning lungs. The helicopter crew was shouting encouragement, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. My vision was starting to tunnel, and I knew I was on the verge of passing out. I was maybe 20 feet from the ladder when exhaustion hit me like a wall. My vision started to blur, and I could feel my muscles giving out. The dehydration and blood loss from the past 2 days were finally catching up with me. I went under for a moment, salt water filling my mouth and nose. When I surfaced again, gasping and choking, the helicopter crew was already lowering a life preserver. It hit the water right next to me, and I grabbed it with both hands just as my strength completely gave out. They hauled me up and away from the water, my body spinning as I rose through the air. Strong hands pulled me into the aircraft, and I collapsed on the metal floor, coughing up seawater and shaking uncontrollably. Someone wrapped a blanket around me, while another crew member checked my pulse and pupils. "Jesus Christ," one of them said, looking down at the island below. "Look at that." I forced myself to sit up and look out the open door. The entire beach was covered with infected. Hundreds of them, all standing motionless on the sand, looking up at our helicopter. They filled every inch of visible space, a sea of rotting faces and reaching hands. "How long were you down there?" the medic asked, starting an IV in my arm. 2 days, I croaked, my voice barely audible. 2 days alone with those things? The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "How the hell did you survive?" I didn't answer immediately. I was staring at the island, watching it shrink away beneath us. In the distance, I could see more burning ships on the horizon, smoke columns rising like funeral pyres into the morning sky. "What happened?" I finally asked. "What are those things? Where did they come from?" The crew exchanged grim looks. The medic, A young woman with corporal's stripes sat down beside me and checked my IV. "We were hoping you could tell us," she said quietly. "It started 2 days ago. Some kind of infection, but we don't know where it originated. It's everywhere. North America, Europe, Asia. Reports came in from major cities worldwide almost simultaneously." "Worldwide?" I stared at her. "All at once?" "The first reports came from ships at sea, then coastal cities. Within hours it had spread inland. We don't know if it's airborne, waterborne, or something else entirely. People die, then they come back. And when they come back," she gestured toward the island below us, "they come back hungry." I closed my eyes and tried to process what she was telling me. 2 days ago, I'd been a business consultant flying to Tokyo for a routine meeting. Normal life, normal world, normal problems. Now I was apparently one of the survivors of what sounded like the end of civilization. "How many?" I asked. "How many what? How many people are left?" She was quiet for a long moment. "We don't know. Communications are fragmenting. Some safe zones are holding, military bases, islands, remote facilities. But others have fallen. We're getting scattered reports of survivor enclaves, but no clear picture of numbers." No clear picture. That somehow made it worse than having exact statistics. At least with numbers, you could process the loss. This uncertainty meant that everyone I'd ever known could be dead, or they could be fighting for their lives somewhere, and I'd never know which. "Where are you taking me?" I asked. "Naval Air Station Whidbey Island," the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "It's one of the last secure zones in the Pacific Northwest. You'll be debriefed, medically evaluated, and processed." I nodded and leaned back against the helicopter's wall. Through the window, I could see the American mainland growing larger on the horizon. But instead of the bustling coastline I remembered, I saw smoke columns and dark patches where cities should have been bright with life. "Is there any good news?" I asked the medic. She managed a tired smile. "You're alive. After 2 days alone on that island, you're alive and uninfected. That makes you one of the lucky ones." I thought about Flight 447, about Laurie Hunt and the businessman and all the others, about 311 people who had started a routine flight to Tokyo and ended up as walking corpses on a remote Pacific island. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Lucky." As we flew toward the mainland and whatever remained of civilization, I found myself thinking about that word, lucky. 2 days ago, I would have called my survival miraculous. Now, looking out at a world where the dead walked and cities burned, I realized that sometimes being lucky just means you get to witness the end of everything you've ever known. I had survived, but in a world where zombie apocalypse wasn't fiction anymore, I wasn't sure what that survival was worth. The helicopter carried me away from my island prison toward an uncertain future, leaving behind the infected and the ruins of the world I'd known. But as I watched the ocean pass below us, I couldn't shake the feeling that my real ordeal was just beginning. The world I was returning to wasn't the world I'd left. It was something darker, more dangerous, and infinitely more fragile. A place where the line between the living and the dead had been permanently erased. It was Tuesday, October 16th, day 2 of whatever came after the world we used to know.